When I'm teaching new photography students, they sometimes have a little trouble understanding what the relationship is between shutter speed and aperture. So today I'm going to try and explain how the relationship works using an analogy. So for those of you who don't know, I've got my old film camera here to demonstrate. The two ways that you've got of controlling the amount of light hitting the sensor or the film if you're using a film camera are shutter speed and aperture, which I'm sure you've heard of. So on my old camera here, if I set a shutter speed of say a 250th of a second, which is a fairly typical shutter speed, that's a fairly fast shutter speed. If I adjust it down to, let's say, half a second, you'll probably be able to hear the difference. Press the shutter release, click open, click close. So that's quite a long shutter speed. It's letting the light fall on the film or the digital sensor for longer. The other side of the equation is aperture, which is measured in f-stops. And if you have a look inside the lens on my camera here, you can probably see, if I manually adjust it, there's a set of very fine overlapping metal blades that slide over each other to make a small or a big aperture and everything in between as well. So f16, for example, which is the smallest aperture that this lens will do, is a fairly small hole, and it opens all the way up to f1.8, which is a fairly big hole, fairly big aperture. So the larger the hole, the more light is passing through the lens and hitting the film sensor. Fairly simple. So to explain this exposure business as simply as possible, imagine that this empty measuring cylinder is the film or the digital sensor inside your camera, and that the water is light. And our object is to put enough light into that sensor to make a correct exposure, which is just there at the 1000 millimeters mark. We need to have the water coming exactly up to that point. If the water's higher than that or overflowing, the photograph's overexposed, too bright. If it hasn't reached that mark, it's underexposed, so it's too dark. But fairly simple. So if I put my measuring cylinder underneath the tap here, and I'm just going to turn the tap on very slightly like that. So I don't know if you can see, but the water's just dribbling in. That water is going to come up to that mark, but it's going to take quite a long time to do that. The way of thinking about this is you've just got a little bit of water going in at the minute, small aperture, small amount of light. So if you've got a small aperture, that means that the shutter speed, which is the length of time that this thing takes to fill, is going to be longer. So a small aperture means a longer shutter speed. I'll empty the water out there. This time what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the tap on full blast. That's like a large aperture. So what we've got now is the same exposure as we had before. The water's still up to the mark there, so the exposure is still correct. But the way we got that exposure was with a larger aperture, a lot of light going in, a lot of water going into this container very quickly, which means the length of time that it takes to fill, which is like the shutter speed, is a lot shorter. So in other words, a bigger aperture means a faster shutter speed. So at this point you might want to ask where ISO fits into this equation. Well, for those of you who are brand new to photography, ISO you can set in a digital camera. It determines how sensitive the camera is to light. So to give an example, if you needed to photograph somewhere very dark, like the interior of a church or a museum where you're not allowed to use flash possibly, you would set the camera to quite a high ISO, 1600, 3200, which basically makes the sensor more sensitive to light. You can photograph in lower light situations. If you were photographing somewhere very bright and sunny or a snow scene or something like that, you'd assign a lower ISO, you'd make the camera less sensitive to light, so somewhere about 100, 200 ISO, something like that. So the ISO makes the camera more or less sensitive. It doesn't determine how much light hits the sensor. It's a slightly different thing. But if you wanted to fit it into this little analogy that I've just shown you could think of it like this. The measuring cylinder that I was using is quite a large one. So let's call that 100 ISO. It needs quite a lot of light to, quite a lot of water, quite a lot of light to come into that measuring cylinder before it's full. If we set a higher ISO on the camera, it's like using a smaller measuring cylinder. So this one here, 1600 ISO, that would mean you need a lot less light before you get a correctly exposed photograph. So this is the way I often try and explain how aperture and shutter speed work together to students who are new to photography. I hope you found it useful too. I'll see you next time.